Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Rich Nguyen. I am the managing attorney of MBH Settlement Group in Loudoun County, located in Ashburn. And I thank you all for joining us. I see a few more people joining in. Let's give a few moments for that. And as you probably all know, otherwise you wouldn't be here, the NVAR put out a new set of changes to the standard forms last Wednesday, a week ago. And today I'm going to talk about, I could go over with you in detail those changes. And I thought to myself, what's the best way of going through this and actually giving you something, useful, right? I made a PowerPoint and I went through sort of the descriptions of the changes. And I'm going to go through basically in a format in which if someone came to my office, an agent, a broker, even a buyer or seller came through and asked me what these changes were, my most logical response would be, well, let's look at the old version and look at the new version side by side and see what the actual changes are, and keeping in mind the intentions of the changes, and see where they land, and sort of and that's my goal for today. And so this morning I put together, in the last few days, put together a PowerPoint which I've shared on the top of the screen here. You can see that, and I did a second screen share on the bottom, which is a document compare PDF that shows the side-by-side comparisons of these changes. And looking through it, it's pretty easy to see. You'll see yellow and blue, and I'll scroll through it and I'll point at different areas we're talking about. So what I see here, it looks like everyone is here. So without further ado, I'm going to dive into it. So starting with the PowerPoint. Here again, this is the NVAR Standard Forms Changes. These take effect January 1st, 2022, right around the corner. And again, put out by NVAR, Northern Virginia Association of Realtors. And again, we're putting this on from MBH Settlement Group, and that's me. And again, my contact info is there. If you ever need anything, give me a call, shoot me an email, call me on my office or my cell phone, or text me with any questions you might have. And let's get started. So, and also I want to thank the NVAR Forms Committee and the members of the Attorney Roundtable, and really all the members of the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors who contributed to these changes. It's been about a year since substantial revision has come through, and a lot of calls to the NVAR hotline and discussions and things that agents were dealing with in the wild or in the marketplace were sought to be resolved by these changes. So going through those changes, here's a summary of the 8 forms that were changed, the numbers here. And the first one's a residential sales contract. That's the most substantially revised form. That's the one we'll talk about most today, and that's the most most used one of all these forms. The next one is a home inspection and radon testing contingency addendum. Next one's inspection contingency removal addendum. The exclusive right to sell, exclusive agency listing agreement, optional listing information sheet. And number 7 is important. There's a brand new form, the optional buyer offer cover sheet. That is in response to the current marketplace when there are multiple offers in the 10s and even 20s, we've heard. Agents report back to us, realtors report back to us. And the last one is the sales contract for unimproved land. So diving into the first one and the most substantially changed one, the residential sales contract. Click here. And putting the changes to these forms in context, the intention of the NVAR Forms Committee was to streamline a lot of these forms, to remove superfluous language, restatements of the law, things that were in there that were somewhat helpful, but really, I believe, having done this for 20 years, cluttered up the contract and often led to maybe more confusion than they solved. So these forms have been modified to streamline and remove actually a lot of unnecessary clauses and statements, and also to move around some clauses to where they're more appropriate, where they're more useful, and where they make more sense. And also the second reason, a really important reason, is to address conflicts or ambiguities or confusions in several areas. So we'll touch on those as we come across them in these document comparisons. starting with the residential sales contract. The opening paragraph, which you'll see below here, I'll read it to you, what the Forms Committee has put out as their intention. Has been revised to remove any reference to the cooperating brokerage representing the seller because sub-agency is no longer permitted in Virginia. That is an old vestige of the old way business was done, and it's no longer there. So you'll see the checkbox for buyer and seller is gone, and there's no longer an option for a cooperating brokerage to represent a seller. It's a strange thing to even see, and it's not done anymore, and it's not legal, so it's been removed. That's pretty straightforward. Pardon for the mouse movement. The next one is the extra language about dual representation. There was a statement here that would most likely confuse your average customer, and it was removed because those issues and those circumstances are more properly addressed in the listing and buyer representation agreements. And so that summarizes the opening paragraph changes. Paragraph 2, I'll scroll down and give you time to look at it. There are some subtle, but I think important changes, and I'll move them up so they're side by side for you. So paragraph 2, price and financing. You'll see, most notably, the sales price. That is the first line, and it should be. In my years of doing this, being a title attorney and an attorney, looking through the contract, looking for the sales price, you'd always have to scroll down a little bit further to find it. And the Forms Committee realized, well, if that's one of the most important aspects, let's put it first. So that's there. You get subtle but important change. There also is a comment or a additional language next to down payment, and this is to facilitate cash offers, to make sure those are readily apparent on the first page. And it says, if no financing, the down payment equals sales price. If it's a cash deal, the down payment equals sales price. And the remainder of paragraph 2 remains the same until you get down to seller subsidy. This is a question that comes up once in a while. There have been, in my experience, instances where sellers didn't quite understand what a seller subsidy was, and for whatever reason, it may not be the most self-explanatory word. So here, NVAR Forms Committee, has smartly said, let's put it in plain language that a seller subsidy to buyer results in the seller's net being reduced, and that amount or percentage is stated there. Again, that is a very useful and practical change, and that's something I've seen in the wild in real practice that is going to help some folks understand what that is and what they've agreed to. Despite everyone's best efforts in explaining things, sometimes it's better to have it in writing and in plain language than in legal terms. So the next item in paragraph 2E, there is a change here where it removes the requirement for seller to comply with the reasonable lender requirements. This is already addressed in the title paragraph, which we'll see later. And that basically means that this sentence here was removed because it's just extra language, and that streamlines that paragraph. Paragraph 2F, which I'll touch upon next, is very important. This is a substantial change and a very timely one, and it responds to current market conditions in that it states very clearly on the first page if there's a financing contingency, and there's checkboxes for whether there is or isn't, and also if there's an appraisal contingency, whether there is or isn't. And notably, in the appraisal contingency paragraph, you'll notice that if the contract is contingent on appraisal, the seller will provide appraisers reasonable access to the property, very, very necessary there. But the additional language here states that if the contract, is not contingency on financing or appraisal, there's a negotiation or discussion here that has to be had, and it's whether or not the seller will then provide access to appraisers. So in a situation where there is not a contingency for financing or appraising, appraisal, then you'd have to negotiate that so there isn't any confusion, arguments, disputes over what used to be a very broad access paragraph. So in the old version of the contract, we'll hold on and see later. So again, it truly states if there's a contingency for appraisal and financing, and whether access will be granted if there isn't contingency on that. Let's see. And there's, let's see, next one. And 2G is the next change. And we'll see here, this is just a restatement of paragraph 15. No changes here. They just moved it from the later in the contract to make it more relevant with other contingencies. Because this here speaks about whether or not it states, unless specified in a written contingency, neither this contract nor the financing is dependent or contingent on the sale and settlement or lease of other real property. So it just puts up front for any seller looking at many offers what the contingencies are or may be in the remaining pages of the offer. Paragraph 3, I'll go back to the PowerPoint and let you know the intended changes, or stated changes. Paragraph 3 was substantially streamlined to remove restatements of the law, which are not subject to contract or negotiation, and they've done that. They removed some extra language about what an escrow agent is, if it's a broker, timeframes for depositing money. All those laws apply whether or not they're in the contract. So they were removed because they were really just taking up space and really adding, not adding much to the contract because they couldn't be negotiated, or it is what it is, as they say. And also more significantly, the paragraph now provides the seller with a timely remedy if the buyer fails to deliver the earnest money deposit to the escrow agent. I'm going to take a moment to talk about this in great detail. This is something that I have seen becoming more of a topic of conversation. I wouldn't say an issue, but it's a question that there are situations where we'll see offers or contracts come in where it will say the deposit will be paid to the escrow agent one day after ratification. There have been sort of situations where that one day may have fallen on a weekend, or just the buyer thought they maybe needed more time than one day and didn't realize that and had one day. Under the current version of the residential sales contract, the seller, in a situation where the buyer didn't make the EMD deposit in time, really wouldn't have a good remedy. It would technically be a default under the terms of the contract, but a seller, the option would be to declare the buyer in default, hire an attorney, threaten litigation. But at the very beginning of the processing of a contract, really isn't a good option, or doesn't really give a lot of recourse to a seller in that situation. And a lot of times buyers will inadvertently, or like I said, due to inadvertence, would be a little late. It's a lot of times a de minimis or not a substantial issue if it's just a matter of getting from the escrow agent, getting a check there on the right by the deadline. But the new version, the new changes, give the seller the option to declare the contract void if the buyer hasn't delivered the EMD by the deadline. In that situation, if the buyer, say at 5 days and the 6th day, they couldn't make the EMD deposit, if the seller simply sends a notice to void and delivers it timely and properly, the contract is then void, which would then require still under the void contract provision, the parties, including the buyer, to sign a release of the contract, even if there wasn't an EMD deposit. So that's something important to note. In the past, there's almost, let's say, most of the time would be an EMD in dispute held by the escrow agent, usually the title company. Here's a situation where it's specifically designed in a situation where there isn't an EMD held by an escrow agent, but still the parties are required by the contract to sign a release, just to make sure that there aren't any loose ends or aren't any equitable rights to the contract remaining. And more importantly, in this market, to make sure the property isn't tied up under the possibility or risk or threat of litigation or a dispute that might tie up a property in a market in which there just isn't a lot of supply. So this is very timely, very practical, and wisely added by the NVAR Forms Committee. I applaud them for that. Some best practice points, knowing this change is now going to be in effect in January. Remote deposits. So at MBH, and we have the option of remote deposits from any smartphone. So we have an app called BankShot that allows 24/7 someone to download the app for free and take a picture of the front and back of the check, just like a lot of banks accept deposits that way. And that will get us the, it will enable the buyer to deliver the EMD timely, in a matter of minutes, really, and receive an email confirmation that says date and time, when, how much, and to whom the EMD deposit was sent. And that alleviates any time crunch or stress or inadvertence in setting a deadline that the buyer needed more time to comply with. And so again, it's 24/7. You could download it on a Saturday night, send the EMD in by photos, and have that receipt. It's been then delivered to MBH as a settlement company, and on Monday we'll process the remainder of the accounting to make sure a formal receipt is produced and sent out, but the delivery receipt will be emailed to the buyer in real time. So that's something that we've done for many years now, and it's something that is very timely. It's something that I think people are going to use more and more, knowing that this deposit paragraph has given some teeth, let's say, to for a seller to basically encourage a buyer who couldn't get their EMD to the escrow agent in time. Another scenario could be one in that an EMD is delivered, and by inadvertence or for whatever reason, sometimes checks, don't quite have funds in the account or may bounce. A situation like that, I would encourage both buyers and sellers, buyers and sellers agents, to confirm with the title company whether or not the EMD was timely delivered, and even a step further, maybe that that the funds, eventually came through. But delivery by the buyer in time alleviates all of that. There is one saving provision in that if the buyer is late with the EMD, as long as they do deliver the EMD to the escrow agent, it cures the default. So again, it's not something that is designed to cause contracts to be voided or to cause conflict in this. It's actually to remove that, in that the buyer has more incentive to get the EMD there in good faith, as they've promised, as they're required to do under the contract, and it gets the process going timely and smoothly, and helps everyone get to the settlement table as expected and as they deserve. So going to the next paragraph, paragraph 4, settlement. Yes, something I know very well. In this one, the change, as stated by NVAR, was to clarify that there is one settlement agent which conducts settlement as defined by Virginia law, even if parties perform through split settlement. And also the performance paragraph was moved to this section. So I'm going to speak to that because split settlements are more and more common these days, especially with parties being remote and not really needing to meet at the settlement table in one place. Sellers will oftentimes choose their own title company to do the seller side of the transaction. But this change clarifies that the buyer selects their settlement agent, and by law, the buyer's chosen settlement agent is the one that will disperse funds, that will collect documents, that will do all the administrative tasks to make sure that settlement occurs, which brings up a point about seller side closings. There is a requirement that under the performance paragraph that the documents and funds required to close the transaction must be delivered. I'll read it here. Delivery of the required funds and executed documents, the settlement agent will constitute sufficient tender of performance. So that means even if the seller has their own settlement agent working, say a title company working on the seller side, they still need to provide the documents, executed documents, a deed, and other signed documents to the buyer's selected settlement agent by the settlement date to be timely and to not run afoul of the time is of the essence provision of the contract that we all know well. So, and again, so making sure that the buyer's chosen settlement agent is the settlement agent that will handle all the funds. And again, reminding sellers that if they are anticipating using the funds to purchase another property or need those funds for something urgently, that it's not always in the seller's chosen title agent's control as to when those funds can be dispersed, but we normally work closely with the buyer's title company, the settlement agent, to make sure things go smoothly, even in split settlements. So paragraph 6 discusses delivery, and this is an area where there was a redundant sentence, and if you read it, it's very clear. They just repeated that delivery is pursuant to the Disclosure Act paragraph, so nothing too important there, but again, an effort to streamline and remove extra language, just make our lives a little easier. Paragraph 7. Likewise, this whole pink section here was removed. That talks about buyer's rights to void if upon receipt of the disclosures, HOA or condo association disclosures. That was all summarized by providing a link or a reference and a link, if you click on here, to the Code of Virginia sections relevant to that provide for all that. So again, the law applies regardless, and the NVAR Forms Committee decided this is not a treatise on the disclosure laws, so they deleted that, saved about half a page there. It makes our lives a little easier. But again, for new agents and people that may not, agents who haven't been, who are new, who are seeing this contract as their first contract, just make sure they're reminded that the disclosure, the rights to void still apply, and they exist, and they are sometimes useful. So, let's see. And another reason why that was redundant is because the disclosure that the buyer is required to sign provides all that. So buyers will have that knowledge when they do sign the disclosure. Okay. And let's see, paragraph 10. And this is important. Property maintenance and condition inspections. So let's see. So let's see, the intention here was to combine the necessary clauses of former paragraph 11 for access. And it clearly states that seller shall provide buyer, broker, and inspectors reasonable access to the property where the contract is contingent on home inspection, similar to what we saw on the first page where if there is inspection or appraisal or financing, there are contingency, there are allowable access, the seller must allow access for those inspections, for those contingencies and appraisals. And again, similar to the first page, here for the home inspection, let's see, it states that if the contract is not contingent, let's see, on appraisal, parties are able to negotiate access, and this will remove the need for ambiguous and confusing home inspection for informational purposes only that we've been seeing in the last few years. And again, it just gives some certainty to access, so there aren't disputes over who can be in the property and doing what, and also more clearly addresses the walkthrough inspections and who may attend the walkthrough, which basically means not contractors or inspectors unless otherwise agreed. So showing you what that means in the actual revision. And that would be here. So if it's contingent, obviously there will be, so seller will grant access to broker, buyer, and inspectors. Okay, so it's broker, buyer, and inspectors are the three players in this contingency, but this paragraph. If it's contingent upon home inspection or other inspections, the seller will not provide access to anyone for the purpose of conducting inspections except for walkthrough inspections as provided. However, if the buyer wants access for their contractors or other inspectors to be in the property, this box will need to be checked on this line here. And there's a time frame. So it's not unlimited, it's not all the time, it's going to be a time frame the parties can negotiate. So it clearly defines the time, defines who, so there's no dispute as to that, and no unnecessary arguments over access for that. And the walkthrough is important. The last paragraph talks about the walkthrough. Regardless of whether this contract is contingent upon home inspections or other inspections, seller will provide broker and buyer, note how it doesn't say contractor or other inspectors, reasonable access to the property to make walkthrough inspection within 7 days prior to settlement and or occupancy. So if for any reason you want an inspector or a licensed inspector to go through the property for whatever reason, even if there's no contingency for anything, including home inspection, you would need to negotiate it here and check that box. Okay. Paragraph 11, also a very pertinent and timely change. It updates the contract to provide that, let's see, it adds mailbox keys and also smart devices. So you'll see here that smart devices are, let's see, a delivery of mailbox keys, key fobs, codes, digital keys. So those, and seller will transfer exclusive control of any smart devices to buyer at settlement. And that's important. So I have a lot of wireless cameras at my house. And if I were to sell it, I would comply with this and transfer exclusive control. I would just say, hey, maybe a factory reset of those devices just to make sure would be a smart thing to do, because you never know who has apps or controls of that from their phones. So that again updates the contract to modern times, and an issue that comes up used to be just keys, but now yes, codes, digital keys, and exclusive control, which is important. If not, the seller needs to shut off their control and access to those devices and hand them over to the buyer. And again, a hard reset or factory reset of those devices and resetting them with your own passwords and codes would be advisable on that. So paragraph 13, you have here, you'll see it. And it gets again to the smart devices. It says smart device, home devices installed, hardwired or attached to the property. Those do convey unless otherwise agree in writing. So that's covered there. It also streamlined the conveyance checkboxes to remove the pesky no box. So it's just basically a yes. If it's not checked, it's presumed to be a no. And added on the bottom of it, other conveyances, and also the sentence that isn't here, that it's as is, any other conveyances are as is with no additional value, and for seller convenience. And the NVAR Forms Committee worked closely with lenders to make sure that this wouldn't present any issues to buyers and their lenders, and removes the ambiguity that other conveyances may cost substantial amounts of money, which could affect buyers' cash reserves and otherwise change the actual sales price of the property. So that was wisely revised and clarified here. And also items that do not convey. So if there were smart devices or other items that were generally mentioned that the seller wants to not convey, they would write here. And then that resolves any ambiguities with that. Next section, paragraph 17, regarding the BDI, we're just praying insects. So this one clarifies the seller must perform any treatment and or repairs per the recommendation of the inspector. That's provided in this new yellow paragraph here. And that also the seller must provide reasonable access to the buyer, broker, or would destroy insect inspector to perform an inspection. So again, just clarifying access. And as you could probably see, access has been something that in the seller favorable market has been creatively worked around, let's say, by buyers and their agents. And here, the Forms Committee seeks to clarify that, so people aren't having to find creative ways for access, and that people have access, inspectors, et cetera, have access when they need it and deserve it. So that's there. Paragraph 20, title. So near and dear to me. This one, the Forms Committee states that it was significantly streamlined the process, and the parties' rights if title is not marketable and insurable by settlement. So this is, to me, a very substantial change, and I think I understand why they did it. In the past, in the old version, there was this surprise sometimes people would get in a rare situation. in which the for whatever reason, the title search and survey was not received by settlement date. It's a rare occurrence. I haven't seen it that often, but I've heard it happening. Here in the old version, the settlement may be delayed for up to 10 business days to obtain the title report and survey. And only after those 10 days of an extension to a settlement date could then could the seller then void the contract. And so the new version doesn't have that. It's very clearly states who has to order the title search and survey if desired. It says the buyer will promptly order a title report as well as any desired survey. So it's no ambiguity who has to do it. And there's no extension of 10 days if the buyer doesn't do it or if someone doesn't do it. The next part that changed this paragraph is that in the event title, the old version said if title is not good and marketable and insurable, the buyer may, at buyer's option, either declare the contract void in writing or B, pursue all available legal and equitable remedies. So it gave, sort of suggested some options, gave the right to void, and was in a way advising or stating that the buyer had other legal recourse that they could take. The new version really doesn't give any suggestions or really other options. It removes the right to void. So it says the seller will convey that title is good, marketable, and insurable with no additional risk premium to buyer or non-standard exceptions. In case there isn't an issue with title and it's required to be perfected, the action must be taken promptly by seller at seller's expense. There's no really, they've deleted the right to void by the buyer, and a suggestion that other legal remedies could be pursued. So here it puts the onus on the seller in the case there is a issue on title that arises. Technically, it's not in compliance, or it may be considered default under the contract. And this isn't intended, I don't believe, to cause a default or an issue that creates to prevent the contract from going to closing. It's really designed to give the parties the ability or invitation to negotiate a solution, whether it be an extension, but it puts the onus on the parties to save the deal, to find a way around the issue, and it gives flexibility on the type of issue. Some issues are fairly easy to remedy and take only a few days, and some are broader, and it's not a one-size-fits-all suggested solution of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as voiding a contract would be, and it doesn't kind of raise the stakes by stating the buyer should or can pursue all available legal and equitable remedies. It's almost suggesting litigation. So here it just says, the title should be good, marketable, and insurable, and if it isn't, it kind of leaves it to the parties to figure it out. I think in this marketplace, there is an incentive for buyers to keep contracts going and find a way to work with the seller to make sure issues aren't fatal to the transaction, if you will. So also another significant change is a second bullet point here. It's the contract now prohibits a seller from unilaterally recording an easement, covenant, or other restriction in title between contract ratification and settlement. So looking at this has been, I believe, a big, say, loophole that's existed for a while. Again, I haven't seen it actually become an issue, but it's a loophole that did exist in theory, in that the old version of the contract, the outgoing version, date of ratification. Let's see. Here it is. It says settlement date here. So title may be subject to commonly accepted easements, covenants, conditions, and restrictions of record, if any, as of settlement date. That would mean that the seller could record additional easements, covenants, conditions, and restrictions of record that may not make the property unmarketable or uninsurable, or in that sense, but it would not be something they would have to disclose to the buyer, and would be quite a surprise to the buyer. So it's something in the title company too. So it's something where I see it as it was a loophole. It's not something that I saw exploited or used often or ever really. But here, the NVAR Forms Committee wisely closed that loophole and that the date of ratification is the last date any additional or easements, covenants, conditions, or restrictions could be added. And it's not really to say they can add them that day, it's to give a deadline or a known date, which freezes in time really the title. So at that point, I would say sellers, any seller that's thinking about recording an easement, covenant, condition, or restriction, that's rare, doesn't come up very often, they better think twice about doing that after they ratify. So that's that. So it's subtle legal distinction, but it's important to note there. Okay, paragraph 26. All right. Default. And this is a paragraph as an attorney and a title attorney now. I would review this paragraph first before anything else, and then dive into the rest of it. But these days, as a settlement attorney, the idea now is to make sure the parties have every chance to get to the settlement table and do it smoothly and amicably. The default paragraph, of course, is what happens when things don't go that way. The old version stated basically additional language and really confusing or ambiguous language about the deposit. And it stated that the broker may accept and the seller agrees to pay broker 1/2 of the deposit in lieu of the broker's fee. But it also stated in other parts of the default paragraph that the broker would be entitled to its full fee under the listing agreements and whatnot. So it was conflicting and ambiguous and really didn't add much to the contract. In fact, took away from the clarity of the contract. So that's been removed. So there's no more mention of splitting the deposit, maybe agreeing to pay and forfeiting and walking away from other liabilities. It relies on the other documents that clearly define sellers' liabilities to their brokers for their fees, the listing agreement for one, to control those situations and not the contract. More importantly, because the brokers aren't parties to this contract. So again, it wasn't the right place for it. So wisely, it was removed. Okay. And 27, scroll down for me. The void contract. So I touched upon this earlier in the context of the EMD. If it were not delivered timely and the seller got wind of that and delivered a notice to void, the contract would be void. And this gets into a bit of a legal theoretical discussion. So when the contract is void, if there's no other obligation or requirement, the parties walk away and say, okay, well, we're done with that, and there's no EMD, we walk away. But in this situation, this contract states that, and it has for some time, if this contract becomes void and of no further force and effect without default by either party, both parties will immediately execute a release directing that deposit, if any, and this is the new wording report, if any, be refunded in full to buyer according to the terms of the deposit paragraph. So this makes it clear that in the scenario in the deposit paragraph 3, even if there's no deposit and no need, some might think there's no need then for the escrow agent to receive a release because there's no deposit to release. Well, that's not the case. Even if there's no EMD being held, both parties are still required to sign a release and to comply with their obligations, even in the situation of a void contract, which so that's very clearly spelled out here. In the event a party didn't sign the release when asked to, that leads to contractual penalties such as attorney's fees and damages. Again, not to make this contract more adversarial, but it just gives another incentive for the parties or a buyer to make sure a property that was on the market, went under contract, the contract fell through, was void, isn't tied up in needless litigation or ambiguity, is back on the market and can be listed again to keep things going. Okay, so paragraph 30, time is of the essence, as we all know. And this was cleaned up. It removed complicated options for the parties to extend settlement date in the event of a delay caused by TRID disclosure requirements. That's Truth in Lending RESPA integrated disclosures. This was a concern when the new regulations came out from the CFPB, but it turns out to have not been an issue in the wild or in practice, let's say. So it caused confusion, and so that additional language was removed, was in 35 here. So this additional red paragraph was removed, and basically gives the parties the opportunity to negotiate extensions if they want to, put the ball back in the parties' court where they can figure out the best way to save the deal, extend it, and get everything to closing. So paragraph 32, this just combined some boilerplate and just cleaned up some paragraphs that were separate about counterpart signed, being the same instrument, faxes being considered originals, and typewritten or handwritten provisions will control pre-printed provisions. So that's pretty straightforward. And other ways to clean up and make the contract work better for agents, the NVAR Forms Committee removed the other provision section, and because the thinking was, and I agree with it, that it encouraged realtors to practice law by drafting language beyond the templates and clauses provided, especially those inconsistent with other terms in the contract. A better place, they thought, and I agree, to do that is to include those other terms in an addendum, the addendum sale form. And that's something I've seen, or I see a lot, or hopefully will not see much more of, which was quickly written short sentences that intended to do more than they really said, but that would lead to ambiguity and confusion that when you go down that road, usually people have to be referred out to an attorney to advise them as to what that specially drafted, very creative clause means to them, and what it means to the parties, and what it might mean to a judge looking at this contract from afar. So again, trying to avoid that from happening so the parties get to the settlement table. So the other provisions taken out, not inviting armchair lawyers to ply their craft, but just keeping things in the forms as much as possible, using the form language as much as possible. And these forms, again, are being streamlined to facilitate that. And other minor places where you'll see changes, the word shall was replaced with will. So again, streamlined and made it make more sense. And now the contract is 12 pages instead of 13 after all of those changes and deletions and streamlining. So it's good. Save a few trees out there if we can. We have a little bit of time left. I'm just going to go through some of the summaries of the other forms that were changed. That does include the changes in the residential sales contract. If you do have questions about those changes or have comments, I'd be happy to, you can email me, or I believe in the chat. I can follow up later on questions from the chat box and let you know some more information about those. In fact, maybe pop on there and see. Yeah, and I will answer those questions offline. Some of them are more detailed I can get to in the next 14 minutes. But going into the next set of forms that have been revised, the home inspection radon testing contingency addendum. I'll see if I can pull it up here for you, side by side. There. Go back to the top. You'll see, I'll just state for you without having to scroll through it, running out of time. It was revised to streamline repetitive language regarding the utilities being in service. It basically removed the or as otherwise agreed. That just means those utilities must be in service up through settlement date. And the consequences for failing to deliver documents or take action on time is stated through the form. Also, this is important. It states that the home inspection contingencies discussed in that addendum are inspections that are pretty much any inspection except for ones in which the NVAR already has separate forms, clauses or addendums, which would be radon, well testing, well inspection, or septic inspection. And the ICRA, inspection contingency removal addendum, this again clarifies access. So in a situation where there was an inspection, home inspection contingency, and there were items to be repaired by the seller. This states that the seller will provide access to the buyer and broker, which is the default situation. So all walkthroughs are allow the buyer and buyer's broker to attend. But of course, as we mentioned before, the inspectors are intentionally excluded as a general rule unless agreed to or allowed in the addendum. So here there's a place for the inspector to be allowed access to check or to review the seller's agreed upon repairs at the final walkthrough. So they add back the inspectors in the removal addendum. And some changes to, minor changes to the exclusive right to sell and exclusive listing agency listing agreement. No checkboxes removed. They made it mirror the residential contract with other conveyances and does not convey. I won't take much time to go over those are self-explanatory. Optional listing information sheet, that's something that was a new form that everyone found very helpful. That leads into the last form I have time to get into. It is the optional buyer offer cover sheet. So there was not a version of this last year, and this is a totally new form. And it's similar to the optional listing information sheet. It's an optional form that does not become part of the contract. And I would add that if there's any conflict in the terms of the offer cover sheet and the actual offer, the offer itself controls. But this could assist listing agents in reviewing or comparing offers by summarizing all the most pertinent information in an offer. So that's what it's intended to do, and I think it does do that. And when you're looking at 5, 10, 20 offers, as a lot of you have in the past few years, it gives you a quick rundown of those offers. So here, I'll show it to you on the right here. There isn't an old version, so it's clean here. It just has, it states here clearly what we've said. It's not part of the contract, it's sort of informational, if you will. And any inconsistencies between this cover sheet and the contents of the offer, as I stated, or ratified contract shall be resolved in favor of offer or contract. So it tells sales price, down payment, if it's financed or not, seller subsidy we talked about, escalation, and all the contingencies are lined up right here. You'll know in about 5 seconds how good an offer, how strong an offer this is versus other ones. I think this is going to be a very popular form that will be attached to all offers going forward, I have a feeling. And also, it has a part at the bottom where in writing, cooperating broker agent requests a confirmation that it's been submitted to the seller or sellers, or that they've waived. So it requests that in writing, which under the ethical rules require a response, and it gives a place for the listing broker agent to respond to that request there. So that's an important form. It's a new form, and it's clearly a result of the market we've been in, and saves, I would say, on the front end, a lot of reading by listing agents. But I would put this caveat out there, because the terms of this offer sheet don't control, if there is any inadvertent or, let's say, discrepancy, you should always look very closely at the actual offer. I know if you get real busy and there's so many, just make sure the ones that rise to the top get a more thorough reading, and as I'm sure they would, to make sure there isn't a discrepancy, either a typo or just the checkbox is off. Basically, don't rely on this cover sheet as the end-all be-all. But like I said, it's a good, quick summary, quick glance, and might save some time explaining to your sellers and narrowing offers down. If it is, by sales price first, and then getting into the nitty-gritty, which is which contingencies, if any, and the details of the actual transaction. So, and that's really the last form that I think is pertinent for today's discussion. There are actually some form changes to the sale contract for unapproved land. That contract tracks very similarly to the residential sales contract. I'm not going to go through it in detail here. But again, I've gone through all of the forms that have changed. I'm going to go back to the front and just review that again. So all 8 forms that have changed, we've touched upon, mostly on the residential sales contract. Those are where most of the changes occurred. And and then all through here, and the optional buyer offer cover sheet, excuse me, and that sales contract for unimproved land. So I know I went pretty quickly through a lot of changes. A lot of these are going to, I think it's going to resolve a lot of what would have been issues in the past and give clarity to parties to a transaction. If anyone would like a copy of this PDF compare, I'd be happy to send it to anyone if you just email me.